Good afternoon, everybody. It's almost 5 o'clock. It's time for another in the Shack series of online seminars. And here's our chairman, Frank James, to get us going. Over to you, Frank.
Thank you, Rob. Welcome everyone to this Shack seminar, which we are running in lieu of real live meetings until just knows when, some point this year or next year. A few housekeeping points. First of all, this is being broadcast both on Zoom and on our YouTube channel. At the moment, we've got people who have registered for the YouTube channel. If we get another 36, i.e. 100 people registered for the channel, then we get a much easier and a much higher profile on YouTube. So if you haven't registered for YouTube, please do so. As for questions, if you could put it in the chat box, I will then at the end ask people to sort of speak, and Rob will demute you. And also in the YouTube, whatever the chat box is called on YouTube, that's being monitored, and I'll be sent details of those questions. So you can use either Zoom or YouTube to take part in this discussion. So let me just go straight on to introduce today's speaker, who is Megan Piorko, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia. She completed her PhD in history from Georgia State University and held a few research fellowships in various places, like Library in Philadelphia, before being appointed to the really prestigious postdoctoral fellowship at the Science History Institute. Her thesis was on Arthur Dee and materiality of 17th-century alchemical texts. And finally, she has a strong and active role in Shack as Shack's communications editor. So over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today with me, and also thanks to Shack for inviting me today. So I really look forward to everyone's comments and questions after this, because I'm coming to early American studies from an early modernist and Europeanist standpoint, so this is a relatively new research of mine. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint and get started. All right.
I'm just starting. I can read that during the break, unless you're going to be here. I think she's only going to speak for about 20 minutes.
Okay. And I'll tell you about it later.
Okay.
So, thanks. So in this talk, I will be using Arthur Dee's only hand-pressed text, Fasciculus Chemicus, first published in Latin in 1631 and then in English in 1650, to trace American reception of 17th century alchemical texts and ideas. I defended my dissertation last year, which studies Arthur Dee's life as son of the renowned polymath John Dee, his career as alchemist and royal physician to the Tsar, and the materiality of his print and manuscript texts. I held a short-term research fellowship at the Library Company of Philadelphia in September this past year, where I came across Benjamin Franklin's personal copy of the 1650 English Fasciculus Chemicus. Naturally, I had a lot of questions which I will address in this talk. What was Benjamin Franklin's interest in 17th century alchemy? What can his personal collecting practices tell us? How does early modern alchemy fit with his intellectual worldview? And what can be gleaned about early American reception of alchemy more broadly through the lens of the long life of Fasciculus Chemicus? Fasciculus Chemicus first made its way across the Atlantic as a special dedicatory copy from Arthur Dee to John Winthrop Jr., who was the first governor of colonial Connecticut. And this text was later donated by the family to the Beinecke Library. In this handwritten title page dedication, which you'll see on the screen here, Arthur recites a quote from the Roman poet Ovid, translated into English, it says, "'Tis not always in a physician's power to cure the sick. At times, the disease is stronger than the trained art." And this is a reference to the type of Paracelsian itrochemical medicine that Dee practiced as a royal physician. Benjamin Franklin had an intimate correspondence and collegial friendship with Harvard professor John Winthrop, who is a descendant of John Winthrop Jr., where Ben Franklin and him exchanged information about their respective personal and institutional libraries. John Jr.'s copy of Fasciculus Chemicus was not donated to the Beinecke until 1800, and so it's entirely possible that Ben Franklin was aware of the dedicatory copy in the Winthrop family library. And this may have been a factor in Franklin's acquisition of his own personal copy of the text. It's generally accepted among historians that transmutative alchemy declined in Europe and colonial America with the secularization of philosophy and science during the 18th century. As a result, Enlightenment views on alchemy were strongly negative. It was universally disregarded among men of science, with few exceptions, mostly relegated to Germany, while mystical alchemy persisted among secret societies. Benjamin Franklin exemplifies the diverse ways of understanding early modern alchemy during the Enlightenment. In a famous exchange between Franklin and Harvard-educated astronomer and Puritan minister Samuel Danforth, illustrates Franklin's personal belief in and attempts to acquire the Philosopher's Stone later in his life. The quote on the screen says, "I rejoice therefore in your kind intentions of including me in the benefits of that inestimable stone, which curing all diseases, even old age itself, will enable us to see the future glorious state of our America, enjoying in full security her own liberties, and offering in her bosom a participation of them to all of the oppressed of other nations. I anticipate the jolly conversation we and 20 more of our friends may have 100 years hence on this subject, over that well-replenished bowl at Cambridge commencement." This is in reference to Harvard. "I am, dear sir, for an age to come and forever, with sincere esteem and respect, your most obedient humble servant," dated the 25th of July, 1773. Franklin's private belief in the apotropaic properties of the Philosopher's Stone seem at odds with what we know of his public persona and vision in establishing the first free lending library in Philadelphia in 1731. The Library Company was the first scientific society in America. Members of the library were ardent Newtonians, described by Franklin as serious natural philosophers of the experimental school. Franklin's collecting for the public library focused on books with which the regular American working man could engage. As a result, when compared with contemporary collecting institutions such as Harvard and Yale, the Library Company lacked books in languages other than English. I say this to give context to Franklin's personal collecting practices in his home library. With over 4,000 books, it was the most impressive private library of its time. Franklin used no bookplate, rarely signed his name or annotated, but he did have a pencil shelf mark system discovered by Edwin Wolfe II in the mid-20th century. After his death, Franklin left most of his library, unless otherwise specified, to his grandson, Temple Franklin. However, Temple left for England just a few months after his grandfather's death in 1790, never to return to Philadelphia. In just 9 days, Franklin's entire personal library was sold to various collectors and bibliophiles, including William Mackenzie, the first American rare book collector. Many of the Franklin books that contain his shelf marks have Mackenzie provenance. He was interested in early printed books, and he bought Franklin's copy of Fasciculus Chemicus, which you see here on the screen. These faded pencil shelf marks, many of which were subsequently erased by later owners, are the only definitive means to reconstruct Franklin's renowned personal library, as his library catalog did not survive. The discovery helped locate over 1,000 Franklin library texts. A single primary source document corroborates Wolfe's claim a list of books for Benjamin Franklin Bach, Franklin's other grandson. As you can see in this chart, over to the left of the document in the center, each shelf mark contains a C for case number in the first column, followed by an N denoting the location of the book within the case. And in the third column, Bach has added another column for a panel because the cases were stacked to make shelves, and that's what he's referring to there. For example, if you look here at the Fasciculus Chemicus shelf mark, in very light pencil, it says C49 N16, which would indicate the book was the 16th volume in case 49 of Franklin's personal library. 5 17th century alchemical texts can be definitively traced back to Franklin using his shelf marks. In his 1650 English edition of Fasciculus Chemicus, someone has solved the riddle of the pseudonym James Hassole on the title page in the center using a numeric cipher, as well as written the publisher's true name on the recto of the frontispiece over on the right. The Library Company catalog attributes this marginal note of Elias Ashmole Esquire to Benjamin Franklin's hand, and I believe this indicates that the cipher was likely written by him as well. If this is true, here we have an example of Franklin engaging with the type of intentional obfuscation and riddles which were part and parcel to 17th century alchemical texts. Elias Ashmole championed English alchemy in his 17th century publications, including the English Fasciculus Chemicus. Arthur Dee lived to see his hand-pressed text translated into English and published by Elias Ashmole. However, he did not adopt the fervor for accessibility and Anglophone pride that accompanied this mid-17th century spike in English alchemical vernacularization. Ashmole reached out to Dee on January 23, 1650, at the last moment before the English edition went to press. Surely, Ashmole was not pleased by Arthur Dee's less than enthusiastic response 1 week later. I am sorry that you, or any man, should take the pains to translate any book of that nature into English, for the art is vilified too much already by scholars that daily deride it. In regard, they are ignorant of the principles. How then can it any way be advanced by the vulgar? Ashmole responded to Arthur Dee's letter of dissent and defended his work of vernacularization in the prologue to his English edition of Fasciculus Chemicus. Elias Ashmole displayed Dee's work to an English vernacular audience, albeit without Dee's support. However, without Ashmole's English edition of Fasciculus Chemicus, or as he translated the title, Chemical Collections, would Benjamin Franklin have encountered Arthur Dee? Was Franklin even aware that this text was authored by Dee and not Ashmole himself? Today, there are almost twice as many extant copies of the 1650 English edition of Chemical Collections than Dee's original 1631 Latin edition of Fasciculus Chemicus. And the English copies are filled with much more marginalia than the Latin ones, leading me to conclude that, like Franklin, readers engage with the vernacular material more than the Latin. The other 17th century alchemical texts with Franklin's shelf marks are the Last Will and Testament of Basil Valentine, published in 1671. As you can see, it has the Mackenzie provenance. It's an English edition that was printed in London, and Franklin's shelf marks indicate that it would have been number 25 in case 46. The Philosophical Epitaph of William Cooper Esquire, published in 1673, has Mackenzie provenance, is an English edition published in London, and the shelf marks say that it was the 30th book in the 76th shelf or case. Opus Tripartitum de Philosophorum Arcanis, published in 1678, has Mackenzie provenance, was printed in London, but this one's in Latin. And I think that this was part of Franklin's collection because it was by an American alchemist, which I will get into more in a moment. According to Franklin, it was number 40 in case 47. Aurarum Superius by Christian Adolf Baldwin has no provenance, is in Latin and was printed in Amsterdam. This text appears to be an outlier in Franklin's alchemical collecting patterns. However, I believe this can be explained with the second text with which it was bound, 153 Chemical Aphorisms, published in 1688 by Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont in English, printed in London, which again falls within Franklin's alchemical collecting trends. Oops, sorry. So of the 5 17th-century alchemical texts that can be definitively connected to Franklin's library using shelf mark evidence, 4 out of the 5 are English editions, and all are printed in London, if we acknowledge that Franklin likely bought Aurum Superius for the Van Helmont text with which it was bound. Franklin emphasized accessibility for the regular, hardworking American, so it makes sense that he preferred English editions of alchemical texts. While the shelf marks help us to explicitly say that these texts were owned by Ben Franklin, his organizational scheme remains a mystery. According to the shelf marks, his alchemical texts were not shelved together to create a subgenre. It has been suggested that Franklin's shelf marks simply reflect the case in which a text arrived at his residence in Philadelphia, which he would subsequently stack on the previous cases, making it strictly a practical method. However, we may be able to add some more 17th century alchemical texts to Franklin's personal collection. In a letter dated December 22nd, 1745, Franklin wrote to his book dealer, William Strahan, about books he ordered for the public library. He ends the letter with a special personal request. Please to add to the enclosed list the following books for me, viz. Starkey's Pyrotechny, Asserted, an old book. Pyrotechny was effectively a synonym for alchemy, or manipulating matter by means of fire, which was a definition popularized by Van Helmont. Thus, this letter is evidence of Franklin seeking out an explicitly alchemical tract from his book dealer. A copy of the 1696 English edition of George Starkey's Pyrotechny Asserted, printed in London, can be found in the Library Company's special collections today. Curiously, the library catalog has no provenance information on this book. This copy has been rebound and is missing the original paste down where Franklin recorded his shelf marks. It is important to also note that Franklin only began using this shelf mark system after his visit to Paris in 1785, which was relatively late in his career. The letter to his book dealer is dated 40 years before he began using his shelf mark system, offering yet another explanation for the lack of the telltale marginalia. Some biographical aspects of George Starkey's life make him a natural fit with Franklin's philosophy. He was born in Bermuda and graduated from Harvard in 1646. Although he spent most of his alchemical career in London, he was a colonial American alchemist. He coined the phrase philosophy by fire, meant to demean academic learning in favor of experimentation. Franklin had alchemical connections to Harvard, outlined in the letter to Samuel Danforth about the Philosopher's Stone, but also emphasized a hardworking American mentality encapsulated by Starkey's attitude toward experimentation. Starkey was also known to have influenced Isaac Newton, who was the primary philosopher championed by Franklin's Library Company Scientific Society. 2 additional Starkey texts are in the Library Company collections that may have belonged to Franklin. 1, Nature's Explication and Helmont's Vindication, published in 1657, is published under the name of George Starkey. The other, Ripley Revived, published in 1678, is published under his pseudonymous alter ego, Irenaeus Philalethes. Both have Mackenzie provenance and were published in London, fitting with Franklin's alchemical collecting patterns, which I have laid out. Franklin owned a Starkey text that has the telltale shelf marks, Opus Tripartitum de Philosophorum Arcanis, but it was published under Starkey's pseudonym, and it's unclear whether Franklin knew that Starkey and Philalethes were the same person. Thus, what first appeared to be a random assortment of 17th century alchemical texts containing Franklin's shelf marks when analyzed in the context of Franklin's broader personal and public collecting trends, are actually a group of texts which demonstrate a very specific interest in 17th century alchemy on the part of Benjamin Franklin. I would now like to examine a 19th century example of the early American reception of Fasciculus Chemicus through the lens of Allen Hitchcock. Hitchcock is most well known for the second version of his text, Remarks Upon Alchemy and the Alchemists, published in 1857, where he codifies his spiritual explanation of alchemy. However, 2 years earlier, he anonymously printed a pamphlet with a similar title, Remarks Upon Alchemists, and the supposed object of their pursuit, under the name of an officer of the United States Army in Carlisle, Pennsylvania at the Herald office in 1855. He donated this pamphlet directly to the Library Company of Philadelphia. As far as I can tell, this is the only extant copy. In his second work, he explains that the anonymous pamphlet, quote, was intended for the eye of my friends and was not published or put on sale. This is probably in defense of the poor review it garnered in 1856 Westminster Review. His unpublished pamphlet, Remarks Upon Alchemists, opens with a detailed personal account of his rediscovery of and reaction to the 1650 English edition of Fasciculus Chemicus. The following is a summary and a few excerpts from his experience, as told by him. It was July 1854, and Hitchcock had just returned from an army tour on the Pacific coast. He writes, I strolled one day into Bang's auction bookstore in Chatham Street, New York, and I observed among the books a small volume with the word arcanum on the back of it. He asks himself, what hidden matter can be in this little volume, and opens it at random. He goes on to describe the book as, the first half of it was taken up with what was called chemical collections, while the second half was styled hermetic secrets. Ashmole included a tract by Jean de Spagny with a running title of Hermetic Secrets after Fasciculus Chemicus, which he bound with his translation. Hitchcock writes that the date at the close of the preface was published in 1650, and it is clear from this description that he's holding a 1650 English edition of Fasciculus Chemicus. He then makes a limit bid of $2, citing the book being a little old sheepskin bound volume, which if judged by its size and appearance might not bring on sale over $0.25. After purchasing Fasciculus Chemicus for only $1, he states, as there was nothing in the streets through which I passed to attract my attention, I soon opened my little arcanum book and began to read the preface. The anonymous army officer, now known as Allen Hitchcock, shares with the reader his inner monologue while reading Fasciculus Chemicus, which culminates with this interpretation. I discovered that the object of the alchemists was not a veritable stone of any sort, and that they were not in search of means by which metals might be transmuted into gold, but that the philosopher's stone was a mere symbol of something else. The philosopher's stone is the symbol for wisdom, and the problem of the alchemist is how to attain it. 17th century alchemical texts were deliberately written in obscure and secretive language during their own lifetime, which frequently became meaningless in the next. With the 18th century triumph of reason, there grew a disdain toward the occult aspects of alchemy. By the 19th century, alchemy was almost exclusively associated with its occult properties and was grouped with other magical and mystical themes. As you can see in this example from the 1835 Library Company catalog, alchemy is listed with occult philosophy, astrology, and demonology. And this resulted in a mid-19th century fervor for a spiritual type of alchemy. However, it appears that Hitchcock produced his own version of spiritual alchemy independent from the philosophies of his contemporaries, such as Mary Ann Atwood. In his texts, Hitchcock interprets alchemy as a Protestant parable. He argues that alchemical transmutation is an allegory for morality, with the philosopher's stone being the culmination of an absolute moral life. According to Hitchcock, Mercury symbolizes the conscience, and an underdeveloped conscience is described with arsenic, vitriol, vipers, etc. This is why the alchemist is always looking for true Mercury, or the perfection of conscientiousness. While his particular understanding of alchemy is unique, Hitchcock embodies the mid-century spiritualist interpretations of subsequent revival of alchemy, which is happening in Europe as well. In general, it was believed that alchemy was a process of spiritual enlightenment rather than physical experimentation or actualization of chemical processes. According to popular 19th century explanations, alchemists used chemical language to couch spiritual, moral, or mystical processes in allegorical guise. The problem with this and subsequent spiritual, Jungian, and strictly esoteric versions of alchemy is that they have no historical founding. Hitchcock fails to recognize the cultural context of 17th century alchemical texts, which, 200 years later, is far removed from his own. Additionally, Hitchcock's moral interpretation of Arthur Dee's text does not align with Dee's alchemical life and works in the slightest. Arthur Dee was a royal physician. He had a legitimate medical degree and claims to have physically made the Philosopher's Stone with the intention of replicating it. His text, Fasciculus Chemicus, is a step-by-step guide to alchemical transmutation through practical experimentation. After detailing his encounter with Fasciculus Chemicus in 1854, Hitchcock admits to becoming obsessed with old, worm-eaten, worn, and soiled alchemical texts with odd titles. Toward the end of his life, he even became somewhat of a mystic himself, reading Rosicrucian texts with his friends on his deathbed. No one writing on him, not even Arthur Waite, has stopped to wonder about the alchemical texts that radicalized this puritanical military man. To conclude, tracing the reception of Fasciculus Chemicus through the characters of Benjamin Franklin and Ethan Allen Hitchcock illustrates an extremely nuanced understanding of 17th century alchemy. Franklin identified as an ardent Newtonian, felt an affinity toward the regular, hardworking American man, and believed that he could receive the Philosopher's Stone at Harvard to have an extended life with 20 of his colleagues. And Hitchcock, a skeptical Christian military man, ended up an alchemical convert of sorts, studying Rosicrucian texts as he contemplated his own mortality, and, after his life-changing encounter with Fasciculus Chemicus, dedicated the rest of his life to writing on spiritual alchemy and collecting old alchemical texts. What these examples of interaction with Fasciculus Chemicus and other 17th century alchemical texts prove is that alchemical reception is not a monolith, even in the context of one person's beliefs and collecting practices. The examples that I've discussed today are of characters who, on the surface, seem to embody the intellectual history narrative of the Enlightenment triumph of reason and 19th century trends toward Victorian occultism. However, an inventor and an army general both found something in 17th century alchemy to incorporate into their respective worldviews. If we follow the American reception of Fasciculus Chemicus to present-day Philadelphia, specifically to its 2019 acquisition into the Othmer Library Special Collections at the Science History Institute, we can find further evidence of its American reception and the cycles of monetary and intellectual value surrounding this text. In a letter to booksellers titled Early Chemistry Books, Roy G. Neville, a 20th century American collector, wrote, "Listed below are books for which I am particularly searching. I am always interested in alternative editions and in other works by these authors. My early chemistry collection covers the period circa 1500 to circa 1900, with particular emphasis on 1620 to 1850. The collection stresses the development of modern chemistry. Thus, I am anxious to receive details of any book which is of significance to the history of chemistry." The majority of Neville's alchemical rare book collection was donated to the Othmer Library after his death in 2007. However, One of the texts on his list that eluded him during his life was the English Fasciculus Chemicus. In an attempt to reconstruct Neville's imagined comprehensive early modern alchemical library, the Alchemy Library purchased the English Fasciculus Chemicus for over $5,000 in July of 2019. This text continues to have relevance and be sought out by collectors thanks to the shift in the historiography of alchemy and chemistry studies to focus on the historical lives of alchemists and their texts. In this example, Fasciculus Chemicus is no longer being collected for its believed transmutative or occult properties, but as an historical artifact that illustrates alchemical knowledge-making through the materiality of the text and provides a lens into 17th century alchemical belief systems and practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. That was really super, really interesting. While people are still thinking of their questions, and please put your name in chat if you want to ask a question. I'll exercise my normal chair's prerogative and ask the first question. I mean, you kicked off by sort of saying that sort of alchemy had is seen by historians having declined in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And yet, if you sort of look at people like Franklin, as you've looked at, if you look at people like Thomas Beddoes, whom I've looked at, who certainly uses Mayo's work on gas pneumatic chemistry from the 17th century, you start to see a sort of slightly different story about that transition from alchemy to chemistry. And let us not forget that Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who's not the ideal judge, but still he did say that he did refer to Davy to his face as my dear alchemist. And Davy did not decline the title, interestingly enough. So are you sort of telling us sort of a sort of different narrative about that sort of transition? It wasn't as sharp as the historians of chemistry in the 19th century, early 20th centuries would have liked, but it's a much more gradual process, and people draw on the resources of 17th century alchemical texts for their own work.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there has been like really interesting historiographical arguments made about what happens to alchemy in this sort of like between now and when it was practiced in a practical way in the early modern period. And I think we're still figuring that out in a lot of ways. And I think by looking at specific case studies, we can better understand that, you know, while there is like an intellectual history narrative going on, that everybody is interacting with these texts in a unique way. And it seems to me that certain early modern and 17th century authors are certain people are picking certain 17th century and early modern authors on purpose. Like they're focusing on a particular text or a particular alchemical author. And I think that would be an interesting thing to explore. Like, why was he so interested in Starkey in particular? Was it just because he was American, or was there something about his alchemy that interests Franklin?
Right, thank you. Jenny Rampling has a question. Jenny, could you demute yourself?
Yes, thanks very much, Megan. I have a question about how collecting practices of alchemical books in the in early modern America maybe help us push against this sort of age of reason narrative that you were using. I think ironically, because of course, you know, that story has been very much challenged by scholars examining alchemical texts in the last few years. I'm thinking particularly of Lawrence Principe's new book, which shows that alchemy was still being taken very seriously at the state level well into the 18th century, and the French crown's sort of investing in alchemical projects and so on. So even if it has these insalubrious associations with fraud in those contexts, it's still very much something that's being pursued for practical ends. So there's no sort of easy transition into the world of mystical or spiritual or occult, or however we want to label these sort of non-practical ends. So the reason I was wondering where the book history that you're sharing with us today sort of fits into that story is, as I think I've been part of the Winthrop project for the last few years. where we've been examining annotations in the enormous collection of alchemical books owned by successive generations of the Winthrop family. And it's interesting that the collection clearly grew in the 18th century. So, John Winthrop Jr. had a whole bunch of alchemical books and traded very vigorously with friends back in Europe to get hold of these books. But then, Waite Still Winthrop and then John Winthrop FRS, sort of, again, going well into the 18th century, seem to have been quite avid collectors of alchemical books. So the story that you're telling today actually seems to fit rather well into that story. But, because several of the people I just mentioned were also physicians and used alchemy in their medical practice, I wonder if perhaps there's another practical dimension that's part of this narrative too. And one way of getting at that might be through annotations, underlinings, that kind of thing. So can you share with us if there's any of that kind of evidence in this, sort of, in say the Franklin Library, that might help us to narrow our focus a bit further? Thank you.
Thank you. And that's an excellent article that you all wrote on the Winthrop family collections at the Beinecke. I opened with Arthur Dee's Latin Fasciculus Chemicus that he gave directly to John Winthrop Jr. And then there's the Franklin and the other John Winthrop connection. So I do think that, the way that people are using their alchemical texts, especially the Winthrop family, and their reading practices and annotations can tell us a lot about the practical ways in which they're using them. And you're absolutely right. It does continue on into the 18th century, I think also with Franklin. But the problem with Franklin collection is that beside his shelf marks and case marks of what number they were in the cases, he really did not annotate these books. He didn't, he collected them, but I don't know if it's because he was interested in even though these were for his personal library, not the lending library, that he's starting to think about lending library principles. He just is not annotating in the alchemical text at all. So that's a little frustrating as far as getting to why he's using them. But I would be really interested into delving more into that letter between him and Samuel Danforth about it's just so bizarre to read. He thinks he's going to go to Harvard and him and 20 of his friends are going to live for 100 more years. And he wants to see this country that they're starting, come to fruition. I think it's just an amazing idea, and that he seems to actually believe it, unless there's something that I'm missing in this letter. I think that maybe his correspondence would be a way to get at his practical use of alchemy.
Okay, Sarah L. would like to ask a question. You should de-mute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll probably put my hair away so it won't interfere. Okay. So I already wrote it in the chat. You were talking about the reception becoming more spiritual, but then again, Dee was also influenced by Rosicrucianism. So how is this new spiritual interpretation, let's say, more spiritual than his own Rosicrucian views? Could you elaborate on that, please? Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. That's a great question. I think this, the spiritual properties of alchemy were also there. Like I said, Dee's text, Fasciculus Chemicus, is about practical application of alchemy, but he also believed that there was a secret Rosicrucian brotherhood among his colleagues that he was constantly reaching out to, trying to get in touch with, to make connections with. And I think that the extension of this, 200 years later, does show a continuation of some of the same alchemical ideas, right? But just if you strip, even Allen Hitchcock's sort of like an enigma. Like he contradicts himself in his own philosophy, which has been pointed out by other scholars. So I think it's hard to figure out, I think he didn't want to believe, but was actually a believer in these esoteric alchemical ideas. But yeah, the Rosicrucian connection is really interesting. I would also be interested, like I said, this is a brand new project, but to look into the Masonic connections between Franklin and Rosicrucianism and American Freemasonry, because Franklin was like one of the founding members of the American Philadelphia Freemason Society as well.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about Freemasonry, but there are plenty more questions at the moment. Alison McManus, then Gary Patterson, and Nick Wilding, and Steve Klukas. So, Alison.
Okay, quite a few questions. I'll do my best to be brief. Thank you so much for this talk, Megan. I know that you had said that you're working to transition into early American history, so I'm going to ask a question in that vein, specifically about imperialism and colonization. I was really struck by that Ben Franklin letter you showed, how he used the language of plenty, the language of liberties, nationalism in his discussions of the Philosopher's Stone. I wondered, what is the relationship of his alchemy to colonization? Is there something imperial about it in addition to something very vernacular about it?
Thanks. Yeah. I don't know if I'm on purpose trying to transition into early American studies. I'm just trying to follow the sources, but I feel like he's pretty vernacular. I mean, there is this sort of push and pull with him about thinking that he is going to go to Harvard with obviously an elite group of men and have the Philosopher's Stone. Like, that's not, the regular hardworking American man, but he wants to connect with regular American people and provide them with a way to be intellectual without being part of, a super hierarchical system, I think. And I don't know that much about Benjamin Franklin beyond his library and collecting practices. So I'm not sure if I would think it was connected with imperialism any more than the fact that he had an elite circle that he thought that he could have the Philosopher's Stone with. I'm also curious if everyone had heard of that letter between Franklin and Samuel Danforth before, because when I came across it, the scholar that wrote about it was like, everybody knows this anecdote. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I hadn't heard of it before. So thank you for your question, Allison.
Okay, Gary, you had your hand up.
Yes. My latest book is Chemistry in 17th Century America. So many people at the Science History Institute know about it. But one of the other John Winthrops was John Winthrop, FRS, okay, who was spent actually most of his adult life in London and was a member of the Royal Society and gave a big donation to the Royal Society of Winthropiana in the mid 18th century. So if you don't have a copy of the book, I'll make sure you get one. But do you know anything about the interactions of Franklin with John Winthrop, FRS, not the other professor John Winthrop at Harvard?
I don't. I'm sorry. That sounds like a fascinating lead, though, and I'll definitely have to get a copy of your book. Is there a copy at the Institute?
Even I had to buy my own copy. But I will buy one. And I mean, I donate all my books to the Institute. I'm on the board.
Yeah.
So, but I'll make sure one shows up at the Institute. In the meantime, I could give you access to the text on electronically.
Yeah, that would be excellent. I'll follow up with you via email after this. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Nick Wilding, you mute yourself.
Here I am. Hi, Megan. Good to see you again. Love the new material. I was wondering about how Franklin knows what's out there, or what the kind of bibliographical resources that are available are. I think the earliest chemical bibliographers are already around in the 1650s. Is there evidence that he's actively using bibliographical tools as a kind of shopping list, or is this just, these are the kinds of things that I want, if you see anything like that, grab it? And it struck me that this group of alchemical texts, all of them are published in the 1670s, apart from the Dee. Is there, but in that letter you have the quote where he talks about, he refers to it explicitly as an old book. Is there an antiquarianism at work here as well? Is he actively seeking out early editions or things that are already oldie, either to make them more valuable or because they're cheap, because they're not yet collectible? loads of questions there, sorry.
Yeah, no, those are all really interesting. To the first part of your question, like, is he consulting catalogs? Like, why is he picking the text that he's picking? I would love to know more about that. But I do know that he had a really impressionable trip to London before he wrote to his book dealer. And he had an uncle that he was named after, like Benjamin Franklin, who had his book collection in London. So I think that's where he maybe started wanting to collect, like, obviously he was already interested in chemistry, but early chemistry books from London, I think, is maybe where that interest, at least for him, started, is with his uncle. As far as antiquarianism, I'm not sure. That's really interesting. I guess I could look at some more of all of his papers are published online, which is really helpful. So I could look at more of his correspondence with his book dealer and see like what kind of terms he's using when he's requesting personal books. Thanks.
Okay, Stephen Lucas.
Hi. Actually, Nick just asked my question. Thanks, Nick. So this is more of a codicil, really, very unalchemical and very mundane. You mentioned that he didn't annotate these books, and I wondered if it wasn't precisely his interest in them as antiquarian objects. As Jenny was saying about, book collecting habits of the period, is this the time when people are starting to think about books as something that they don't want messed up with nasty handwriting, and that he's really viewing them as collector's items rather than as something he might use or reflect upon in that kind of way?
Yeah, thanks. That is probably, I think, what's happening. And also it made me think about how we do have evidence of him writing in a book, right, where he writes Elias Ashmole on the back of the frontispiece, and possibly decodes Ashmole's pseudonym on the title page. So this might be the only example of him like sort of playfully interacting with and using an alchemical text, rather than, if we're guessing, maybe he's collecting them for antiquarian purposes. But he also could have been following Elias Ashmole as an antiquarian himself, and that might have been his interest in Ashmole, and maybe not really with Arthur Dee at all. Thanks.
Okay, Ted Hand. Did you mute yourself? Oh. Okay. Joshua Zint, in that case. Demute yourself.
Hello, thank you so much for your work, Dr. Piorko. And of course, during your research, did you find references of, or references to, or examples of either the text or symbol of Dee's hieroglyphic monad, or even just part of it in the introduction where there's a sort of moral allegory to alchemy and its motivations in the pursuit of the mens adepta, or the mind of the adept? Now, did you find any references to Dee's glyph, either in Hitchcock's or Franklin's annotations or writings?
Great, thanks for that question. So that would be John Dee's Modus Hieroglyphica, so the father of Arthur Dee. And for Franklin, yeah, I'm not sure he cares much about John Dee or Arthur Dee and the lineage at all. If he's, collecting these for antiquarian purposes, probably more focused on Elias Ashmole. Hitchcock very well may have written on John Dee. I didn't go into his second text that much, except just to see that it was different from the pamphlet that he gave directly to the library company, in that he doesn't mention this like first, life-changing experience with Fasciculus Chemicus at all. I think because it got a lot of criticism. So if you go look at Hitchcock's second text, which has a really similar title, it's on archive.org, and he goes through like Meyer and treats a lot of well-known alchemists in that text. So you could find something there on John Dee and his Modus Hieroglyphica.
Thank you. Sorry, get your name wrong, Joshua, but I only got on the chat box, so the first four letters come up. So I'm sorry about that. Simon Werrett, you demute.
Thank you very much. I didn't know if we were going to get to me, so I wrote my question out. But anyway, So thank you very much, Megan. Terrific talk, really interesting stuff. The thing that I was struck by is the different kinds of temporality in your story. So on the one hand, you've got the kind of classic, the elixir, the extension of life. And then there's the sense that Franklin, he seems to be finding that kind of amusing, imagining living into the future. But that idea that there is a future to live into and that there's a history of the country that he's in, that's kind of a new way of thinking at the time. And it's a very different way of thinking to what's going on in the 17th century, and that seems to be where there's a kind of nice clash of temporalities there. And then you've got so there's that kind of intellectual understanding of time changing, but then you've also got this really material story about time and the way that things decay and get lost. The books disappear, the library comes apart, and then there's this attention to making the books endure because Franklin wants them to be lent out and on those collectors. So you've got these kind of 4 different time things happening in the story, and I wondered, can one kind of link up the very material story that you have with the changing sense of time that brings about the kind of jokiness of alchemy by the time you get to Franklin's comments on the USA. So sort of, is there something, can one bring those together? I've no idea if there's an answer to that, but it's just a thought.
I don't know, that's a great idea. I love that lens of temporality, especially with books, because that's what kept like occurring to me. It was like, I'm doing the same thing. Like, I'm just like Hitchcock, right? With this exact same text. I'm so excited about this one text that he was so excited about. Like, I'm holding Ben Franklin's copy of this text in my hand. Like the idea that a material can last, like they're looking to extend their life to see this like intellectual legacy, but it does last in the materials. And that is a really interesting lens. Thank you.
Okay, Joe Henderson.
Yes, well, it was kind of related to this, and I was just wondering if you're actually planning to look at the tradition of radical extension of life as it develops in the 18th century. I mean, to me, it's, I mean, I should be looking at that article that Jenny was mentioning, because it's not clear to me, is this a satire, or does he actually mean it? Because obviously in the early 18th century, there is this whole tradition of kind of satirizing this idea of radical extension of life. But then, of course, towards the end of the 18th century, you have this very enthusiastic supporters of the idea, like D'Orsay and Godwin. So I'm wondering where we can actually place Franklin along these lines.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. Like, I wasn't sure if he was being entirely serious either, because it's so earnest, and it seems so against like how we imagine Franklin to be. I personally wasn't. This is not really like, it's a little bit outside the scope of my research. I was just trying to frame like that Franklin has some connections to Harvard and ideas about alchemy, the Philosopher's Stone. So no, I wasn't planning on looking more into the idea of the radical extension of life, but that does seem like something that goes with your work a lot. So feel free to look into that.
Okay, yeah, just go back to Ted Hand's question, which just skipped across because it seems to have disappeared. I'll ask it on his behalf, mainly because also it's a question I was going to sort of ask in a slightly different way. Specifically, he's interested was Freemasonry also a context for Hitchcock's spiritual alchemy? And I just wanted to sort of talk about Freemasonry a bit, both as a historical phenomenon and as something that's really, really hard to research, because modern Freemasons are very, very difficult to work with in my experience. Yeah. And my particular interest is David, who I'm 95% certain was a Freemason, and to this day the Freemason branch in Penzance is called the Davy Lodge, and I sort of wrote to them and said, well, do you have any evidence that Davy was actually a Mason? And because you got he's named after, and then they sent me this totally rubbish email saying, well, you know, I mean, just because we name a lodge after somebody doesn't mean that person was a Mason. I thought, come on. So I'm just wondering how you approach this kind of problem, both as a historical phenomenon, but also as something that's actually quite difficult to research because of modern issues.
Yeah, thanks. I've come across similar issues. Like I had a weak attempt to try to contact some Freemasons. There's a big group in California here in the United States too, and they have pamphlets, especially from the 60s. They were maybe trying to recruit them, and the pamphlets explicitly say we are not connected to alchemy, we are not connected to Rosicrucianism. So they seem to really want to distance themselves from that tradition. But to make the connections that I think we do want to make with figures like Benjamin Franklin and alchemy and Freemasonry and Davy, I think there's an intellectual history evidence and also visual culture evidence that we can use to show at least some sort of lineage, or they're drawing upon these ideas to construct their concept of Freemasonry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've run out of, everybody's stopped having questions. I think it's nearly time to draw to an end. So just to remind everybody that next month's seminar will be given by Simon Werrett on the material turn and the history of chemistry. That's on Tuesday, the 23rd of March at the same time, so 5 o'clock GMT and equivalent around the globe. And also to remind everybody that the Shack with the Royal Photographic Society, we're running a meeting in mid-May to mark the 250th anniversary of the birth of Tom Wedgwood. That will either be a real meeting at the Royal Photographic Society headquarters in Bristol all day on the 15th of May, or if restrictions have not been lifted sufficiently, we will have 2 afternoon meetings on the 14th of May and the 15th of May, and we'll be sending publicity out at some point next month to start bookings. We probably won't make a decision about precisely which format we will use until after Easter, though we might get a good steer from the Prime Minister's statement on Monday, or we might not get a good steer from the Prime Minister's. We shall see. Now, the seminars like this don't happen of their own accord. There's actually a team behind them, and I sort of just love to acknowledge everybody's hard work in bringing this to fruition. That's Rob Johnson, Joe Hedison, Caroline Cobbold, and Chris Campbell, and last but certainly no means least, Megan Piorko, for giving us such a wonderful seminar and inspiring us a wonderful discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Have a good evening, morning, afternoon, depending where you are.
Thank you.